Imagine the worst nightmare a parent could face, losing their child in a way that could have been prevented. This is the tragic story of a sheriff's daughter who died because of a decision made not by a doctor or a nurse, but by people sworn to protect. Her father, the sheriff, always believed in justice and fairness. But when his own subordinates, motivated by deep-seated racism, blocked the best doctor from saving his daughter's life, the very system he trusted failed him in the worst way imaginable. It all started with a simple call for help. The sheriff's daughter was critically ill, and only one doctor was known to have the expertise to save her. But when he arrived at the hospital, things quickly took a dark turn. His skin color became the problem, and the hate in the eyes of some officers at the hospital was all it took to stop him from doing his job. In a moment of shocking indifference, the sheriff's own men allowed personal prejudices to stand in the way of medical care. As her condition worsened, her father's world began to unravel. But the question remains, could anyone have stopped this from happening? And will justice ever truly prevail? Stay tuned to find out. The sheriff, Thomas Carter, had always been proud of his role in law enforcement. He worked hard to maintain peace in his small town, earning the respect of many, even if he was often seen as distant by those closest to him. His daughter, Emily, was the light of his life. Smart, kind-hearted, and always full of energy, Emily was the kind of person who made everyone around her better. When she fell ill, it hit him like a ton of bricks. Despite their best efforts to figure out what was wrong, her condition deteriorated rapidly. After a series of tests, it was clear she needed urgent care, specialized treatment that only one doctor in the area, Dr. Malik, could provide. He was the best, hands down, with a reputation for saving lives that no one else could. But when Dr. Malik arrived at the hospital, something felt off. The atmosphere shifted. It was as if the air itself grew heavier. Several officers, ones that worked under Sheriff Carter, stood in the hallway, blocking the doctor's access. Their eyes were cold, their voices sharper than usual. These men, who had sworn to serve and protect, now found themselves caught in a moral conflict, one they weren't prepared to face. What was more important, duty or their own prejudices? As the minutes ticked by, Sheriff Carter could feel the pressure mounting. He paced outside Emily's hospital room, trying to keep calm, but his mind raced. He knew Dr. Malik was the best chance his daughter had, yet something was keeping him from reaching her. He could hear the muffled voices of his officers down the hall, rising tension, whispers of something he couldn't quite make sense of. Something didn't feel right. His instincts were sharp, honed over years of service, but the reality of what was happening didn't seem possible. He had always trusted his team, but now he wasn't so sure. Inside the room, Emily lay unconscious, her body frail and fragile. The monitors beat steadily, a rhythm that felt all too final. The nurses were doing what they could, but without Dr. Malik's expertise, it was only a matter of time before things took a turn for the worse. The sheriff's gut twisted. He needed answers, but no one would give them to him. Not the nurses, not the hospital staff, and certainly not his officers. Every time he asked about Dr. Malik, the response was always the same: he's not allowed in. The conflict started to unravel when Carter noticed a familiar face among the officers blocking the hallway, his deputy, Brian Hayes, a young man with a promising career ahead of him. Carter had seen Hayes grow up in the department, trusted him like a son. But now, Hayes was standing at the front, arms crossed, an impenetrable look on his face. Carter's heart sank. He knew that Hayes, like the others, had been raised in a town where bias ran deep, where the color of someone's skin could decide their fate before they even spoke a word. But would Hayes really let that prejudice dictate life and death? Hayes glanced at the sheriff as if sensing his gaze. Their eyes locked, and for a brief moment, Carter thought he saw a flicker of guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it came. Instead, Hayes looked away, his jaw set tight. "Sorry, Sheriff, but orders are orders," he said, his voice uncharacteristically cold. Carter's blood boiled. This wasn't just about procedure or policy, It was about his daughter's life, his family's future, and somehow it had become entangled in something far darker than he ever imagined. Meanwhile, word of the standoff began to spread. The small town that once revered the sheriff now began to whisper. Some sided with him, others with the officers. It wasn't just a medical emergency anymore. It was becoming a test of loyalty, race, and power. What was happening inside those walls felt like a ticking time bomb. Carter could feel it. The truth was slipping further and further away, and the weight of his own position was starting to suffocate him. If he couldn't find a way to break through this wall of silence and prejudice, he might lose everything. The hallway felt like it was closing in on Sheriff Carter. He could hear his own breathing, loud and ragged, echoing off the sterile walls. His eyes darted from one officer to the next, searching for a sign, any sign, that someone would break rank. But the officers stood firm, expressions unreadable. Brian Hayes still had his arms crossed, a silent barrier to the only person who could save his daughter. Carter's mind was spinning. He had to do something, anything. He approached Hayes, his boots clicking sharply against the floor. "Brian," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'm not asking you to choose between me and your duty. I'm asking you to do the right thing." Hayes didn't move. "She's my daughter, Brian. You know what this means to me. Don't let her die because of your own personal beliefs. Please." For a heartbeat, Carter thought he saw something shift in Hayes' eyes, a flicker of humanity, of hesitation. But then Hayes straightened, his face hardening once more. "I can't do it, Sheriff. It's not just about you or me. You don't understand what's going on here." His voice wavered slightly, betraying the inner conflict. But he wasn't backing down. "I'm just following orders." The words cut deep, and Carter's anger flared. He had always thought Hayes was better than this. More than just a follower, more than a product of the same town's ugly history. But the truth was sinking in. The very man he had mentored had become another piece in a game he didn't fully control. Carter stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at the others, the other officers who had been standing guard, and then he looked down the hallway, toward the door that separated him from his daughter. Every second felt like a lifetime. He couldn't wait any longer. If no one else would move, he would. He made a snap decision, his mind a blur of rage and fear. Without warning, Carter turned and marched toward the door that led to Emily's room. "This ends now," he muttered under his breath, his voice steady but full of intent. He was done waiting for someone else to fix this. He had to take control, whatever the cost. But just as his hand reached for the door, a voice rang out behind him. "Sheriff, stop." It was Hayes, his voice now strained, almost desperate. Carter didn't turn around. He knew Hayes wasn't just following orders anymore. The struggle within him had reached a breaking point. Carter kept his grip on the door handle, the tension between them thickening like a storm waiting to break. "What now, Brian?" Carter asked, barely keeping his voice steady. There was a long pause, and when Hayes finally spoke, his words were heavy with guilt. "If you go in there, I can't help you anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know that, right?" Carter's heart sank. The sheriff felt the weight of that statement settle on him like a boulder. He could hear the silent plea in Hayes' voice, the hesitation, but also the helplessness. In that moment, everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. The door to Emily's room stood there, just inches away, but it felt like 1,000 miles. The future of his daughter, his career, and his community hung in the balance. And in that quiet, frozen moment, Sheriff Carter had to decide. Would he push through and risk everything? Or would he stand back and let the system he had trusted so long fail him completely? The seconds felt like hours. Just as Sheriff Carter stood frozen, torn between the door and the deputy who had been like a son to him, the silence was shattered by the shrill ring of his phone. It was a number he didn't recognize, but the urgency in the sound made his gut tighten. Hesitating only for a second, he answered, his voice sharp. "Carter." "Sheriff," a breathless voice replied, "this is Detective Hayes. I'm with the State Department. There's something you need to know." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Carter felt his pulse spike. What's going on? I don't have time for games, detective. He could barely focus on the phone call, his hands still gripping the door handle, eyes flickering toward the officers who were now shifting nervously behind him. There's been a complication, Detective Hayes continued, his voice lower now, as if weighing every word. I don't know how to say this, but you need to hear it. There's a larger investigation into your department, and it's not just about Dr. Malik. The words hit Carter like a ton of bricks. He blinked, trying to process what Hayes was saying, but it didn't make sense. What do you mean? He asked, voice trembling now. They've been watching. The officers blocking Malik, they're part of something bigger. It's not just about racism, it's about corruption, and your department's at the center of it. The ground seemed to shift beneath Carter's feet. He felt the air leave his lungs. His department, his men, were involved in something far darker than he ever imagined. But who was behind it? Why was Dr. Malik caught in the middle of this web? Before Carter could respond, Hayes cut in quickly. Sheriff, you have to understand, they've already made their move. Whatever happens next, it's bigger than just you and me. And just like that, the door to Emily's room wasn't the only thing standing between him and the truth. Everything Carter thought he knew, his team, his town, was unraveling before his eyes. His daughter's life hung by a thread, and now the web of lies was expanding, pulling him deeper into a conspiracy that could take down everything he had fought for. His hand shook, and for a moment, he considered stepping back. But something inside him burned. No matter how deep the corruption ran, no matter how far this reached, he had to fight. His daughter deserved that. He turned back to Hayes, locking eyes with the deputy for a long, charged moment. You knew. Carter whispered, barely able to believe what he was hearing. Hayes didn't answer, but his face said everything. Carter didn't need confirmation. He could see the guilt, the weight of the secret, pressing down on his deputy. The stakes had just been raised. There was no going back now. Whatever happens next, Sheriff Carter was about to face not just the fight for his daughter's life, but for everything he had built, everything he had believed in, and someone somewhere was pulling the strings. Carter's head was spinning, but there was no more time to think. He hung up the phone without another word, the harsh reality of what Hayes had just told him slamming into him like a freight train. He took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of strength left in him. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about taking down the rot that had poisoned his own department. It was about standing up to the system that had been so loyal to him, and yet had failed him when he needed it most. His hand was still on the door handle, but now it felt like his entire future depended on what happened next. He didn't even hesitate this time. He turned the knob and pushed the door open, the harsh white light spilling out from the room. Inside, Emily's condition had only worsened. The monitors beeped erratically, a chaotic sound that filled the room like an alarm ringing in Carter's ears. Dr. Malik was standing there, his face tense, trying to do what he could. The officers blocking the hallway had failed, but here he was, still fighting to save her, still pushing back against the system that had tried to keep him out. She's slipping, Malik said without turning around. I need help. Now. Carter moved toward Emily's bed, his heart breaking with every step. He could see the panic in Malik's eyes, but there was no time for any more words. The sheriff had made his choice. He wasn't backing down. Get her stabilized, Doc. I'll handle the rest, Carter said, his voice cold with determination. His mind was already racing, already making a plan. He had no time to waste. But just as he prepared to take action, a voice called from the doorway. Sheriff, step away from the patient. It was Hayes again, standing at the threshold with two other officers, their guns drawn. Carter's blood ran cold. Hayes was the last person he thought would betray him, but here they were. The deputy had crossed the line. What the hell is this, Brian? Carter's voice was low, but the anger was impossible to hide. You don't get to play both sides. Hayes's face was grim, resigned. I'm sorry, Sheriff. I didn't want it to go like this, but orders are orders. There's no going back now. His voice cracked just slightly, but his stance remained firm. The officers behind him didn't flinch, their weapons aimed directly at Carter. But as the tension in the room reached its peak, there was a sudden, sharp sound, a door slamming open behind them. A figure stepped into the room, a man Carter hadn't seen in years. It was his old partner, Detective Carlson, someone who had been supposed to be long gone from the department. "Carter, get out of the way," Carlson barked, stepping forward with his own weapon drawn, but aimed at Hayes, not the sheriff. "You don't know what you're dealing with."